Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining OASIS for today's Sage 100 Tips and Tricks webinar. And today we're going to be talking about the Accounts Receivable module. As always, your phone lines are muted during this presentation, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So there's a question box on your screen where you can type in questions, and I will answer as many of those as I can during the presentation today. If time does not allow me to answer all of the questions, then I will follow up with you after the presentation and provide you with the answers. As you noticed on the opening presentation, our Sage 100 user group meeting is on June the 27th. It is going to be a half-day presentation, and will be located at the Shelby campus again on Shelbyville Road and Hurstbourne Lane. So everyone should have received an email invitation, and we already have lots of registrations, but if you haven't yet registered, please plan on attending. And if you did not receive an invitation, if you'll just email me after the presentation today, I'll be glad to get someone to forward you an invitation. So again, thank you for joining us, and today we're going to talk about accounts receivable. So we're going to start today, and we're going to talk about, we're going to start in the setup of the module, and I'm going to show you just a couple of different things in the AR options that you might want to be aware of. So in the accounts receivable options, on the main tab, this is where it shows you what your current fiscal year or calendar year is in the current period for your accounts receivable module. And when you do a period end processing, that then goes in and changes this. So you should be doing period end processing consistently. If you're not, before you make any major changes, let us know, and we will make sure that you don't have any settings where you're going to purge out history that you do not intend on purging. We're going to move to the additional tab, and one of the items that I want to show you is this very first one that says open item or balance forward. And you have three options. You could say that your customers are open item, they're balance forward, or they're mixed, meaning that you could have some customers that are open item and some that are balance forward. I cannot think of any of our clients that use the balance forward method. Most everyone uses open item. And what that really means is that when you do a period end processing, if you have a customer that is set to balance forward, and let's say that they have 5 open invoices totaling $10,000, then what it's going to do is it's just going to move that balance forward of $10,000, and you're not going to see the individual open invoices any longer. If you say open item, then whenever you do period end, it just shows each individual invoice and the balance due. So when you're doing a cash receipt, if they're paying invoice 2 and 3 and they're not paying invoice 1, 4, or 5, then you can post the cash receipt to the applicable invoices. If you're doing balance forward, then you're just applying the money that they're paying you, and it just adds it, takes it against the total balance. So let me show you an example of a client that is set up in the system as balance forward and what this is going to do. So I'm going to go into customer maintenance, and it wants me to click a little slower. And we're going to look at O2 Custom. And if you'll notice down here at the bottom, each time that I've done a period in processing, my demo data is in 2020, but you can tell each month where I did a period in processing, and what it's doing then is it's just bringing that balance forward, and you aren't seeing those individual invoices. When I do the period in processing for May, if they haven't paid the May invoices, then it's just going to lump them together and create an invoice number of using kind of the date as that balance forward. So most individuals and companies do not want to do the balance forward method. When you have in your setup, if you have it set to open item only, then that defaults on your customer. If you have it mixed, then you can choose whether it's open item or it's balance forward. But once you make the choice to have it balance forward and you actually have invoices on the customer, you cannot go in and change it back to open item. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm rambling a little bit there, but what you want to, if you know for sure that you never want to use balance forward, then in your accounts receivable options, you should have this set to open item. If it's set to mixed, you could accidentally change a client to balance forward by mistake. And so this is where that setting is kept. And then with any of your setups within Sage 100, you probably want to limit who has the ability to go in and make those changes to the setup. So, limit that to more of a supervisor role as to who can go in and make changes to your setup options in all of the various areas in accounts receivable. So I did want to point that out because occasionally that gets checked improperly, and then you can't see all of those open invoices, or if a client is saying, can you tell me which invoices are open versus which ones I've paid, you're not going to be able to have access to that information. So if anyone has questions about that, you want to go ahead and type those in. I'll be glad to take a look at that in just a couple of minutes. The other option I wanted to show you is the number of days to retain paid invoices. And you can keep this for up to 999 days. And I typically recommend to our clients to keep history as long as you can, because you can always purge the history out periodically. You don't have to, you're not stuck just for 999 days. But what this does, this is also tied to your period in processing. So when you are taking a look at your customer maintenance and you are going in and taking a look at that invoice tab, it shows you all of the invoices as well as their open and paid invoices. So I'm looking at this example. You can see all of the open invoices and the invoices that have been paid. When you do a period in processing, the system goes out and it looks at that field in the setup and it says, okay, they want to keep paid invoices for 999 days. So I'm going to go in and look at each customer, and any invoice that was paid more than 999 days ago, I'm going to purge it off of the screen. So again, you don't want to set that to 0, because if you're doing period in processing and you have it set to 0, when you come in to your customer, you're not going to see any paid invoices at all in the customer maintenance. It's going to basically purge all of those out. So a lot of times you aren't sure how many invoices you're going to generate on an annual basis. And let's say that you have it set for 999 days and you realize that you just have way too much history. You have hundreds or thousands of invoices on a customer, and you decide you really only want to keep the last year. Well, if you make that decision, all you need to do at that point is go back into your options. You're going to change this to 365 days, And at that point, when you do your period in processing, it will purge based on this setting. Now, if you have this set too low and you do period in processing and you purge out the information, there's no way to unpurge that. So you do want to be careful. And before you do period in processing or purging of history in any manner, it's good to make sure that you have a good backup of your system prior to that. So I'm going to just check real quickly and see if there are any questions, which I don't see any questions about that. So moving on, I want to show you this, the aging categories in Sage 100, and this is the setups that we're looking at are company specific. So if you have company ABC and you want to do open item and retain your invoices for 365 days, but in company XYZ, you have different criteria. The setups can be unique for each company code within your Sage 100. So when talking about the aging, within Sage, you can age your invoices by due date or invoice date. Most everyone probably ages by due date, and I believe that's the default when you install Sage. If I have it set to due date or invoice date, my next option is aging categories to be used, and I have the option of days or months. If I have it set to days, it's going to default to 30, 60, 90, and 120 days. But I can modify this. If my business really needs to track my receivables, and maybe a lot of my things are net due upon receipt, or the terms are 10 days, I can actually go in and change this to a different type of aging. And when I accept this, if I go in and I go to run my aging report, it's actually going to age it based on this criteria. And then so it'll base it on this aging criteria, and then whether I'm aging by the due date or the invoice date. If I change this to month, you'll notice that it changes it to 1, 2, 3, and 4 months, but these fields are grayed out, so I cannot modify that. So the only way that you can modify it is when it's set to days. So you can make this change, save it, run your aging report to look at it in the format that you're wanting if you want it aged a little bit differently, and then you can go right back in and change it to the standard 30, 60, 90, and 120 if you want to. But I did want you to be aware that that you do have those options within tracking your aging. And then we're going to jump over here to the History tab, and I wanted to show you this audit field at the very top left. And this is asking if you want to track customer changes in accounts receivable. And your options are none, which means it will not track any changes. You can have it track all changes, which means it includes any customers that are deleted, any additions, any customers that you add to your master file, or any changes, meaning the customer moves and you change their address, you change their phone number, their website, anything like that. You have the ability to track it, number one. And then number two, you have the ability to track the additions in detail. And I'm kind of a detail girl, so anywhere I can track detail in my system, I have that checked, but it's certainly up to you if you want to track that type of detail. So with this being set to all, anytime that I add a customer, I delete a customer, or I make changes within their master file, it's going to track that for me. So there's a couple of reasons that you may want to track those changes. Whoops. And I apologize. I don't know how that happened. Is that, okay, I do see a question. I'm going to stop for just a moment, and then we'll go back to the tracking the changes. Okay, it says the audio went out, and wanted to know if we're still connected to the call. I've had one person reporting this. Can others indicate whether or not that they can hear me? Okay, thank you for answering that everyone can hear me. Let me reply to this one client. And I do apologize for that that delay. So what we're talking about is tracking those changes to the customer and maybe why you would want to do that. So let's say that your sales team or whoever sets up new customers in your system, you want to make sure that that they're always getting their address, getting a ship to address or a billing address if it's different. You always want to make sure that they are filling in, the zip code with the city and state, that they are getting a telephone number. And you're finding that you go in to look at a customer and there's information missing. If you're tracking those additions to your customer master file, you can actually run a report to see who added that customer so that you know who to go talk to let them know, the expectation of setting up those customers, and maybe it's an opportunity to do some retraining. Another scenario, and this would probably fit me, is that let's say a customer sends you a change of address, and you go in a hurry, you change their address, and 3 or 4 weeks later they call you and say, you're still sending our invoices to the wrong address. And I'm thinking, well, I did change someone. I wonder who that was. If I'm tracking the information, I can go back in through a report and determine what was changed. So let me show you a sample of that report. I made a change earlier today. Actually, to this customer, I changed their address. And in accounts receivable, under reports, there's a customer audit report. So I'm going to go in and take a look at that report. And at this point, instead of running it for a certain date or a certain user login, I'm just going to preview everything because my report is fairly short. And what it's going to show me is that the user logged in as Pam on today's date, changed this customer. These are the fields that I changed. These are the original values that were on the customer, and this is what I changed them to. So you can easily see who made the change and when, so that when everybody goes, wasn't me, you can actually go in and see who it was. Also, if you have the scenario that I just mentioned where I changed the wrong customer, I could go in and find who I changed accidentally, and I would know the original information, so it's easier for me to change it back than have to go look up and see what the information was. So this audit report and something very similar can be tracked in accounts payable for your vendors. It can be tracked in the general ledger for changes made to the GL. It can be, there's an audit report, I believe, in inventory management for changes, additions or deletions to inventory. So it's a good report to have. Now, granted, if you're adding a lot of customers and making a lot of changes, this report can get huge. But what you can do, actually, let me stress this real quick. It asks me when I exit, do I want to purge the file? And typically you're going to want to say no to that so it retains that information. But let's say that you know that particularly you made some type of an error last week and you want to, to go and just look at the changes that happened last week, then you certainly can just run this report for a date range. If you have suspicions that Pam is the one that is not admitting to making all these mistakes, then you could just say, to use the user login that is equal to Pam. And so you can narrow the search down on that audit report, but it can come in very handy in trying to go in and take a look at information. So, but you do have the ability to purge it out at any point if it's keeping too much information. So if anyone has any questions about that audit report or reasons why you might want to use something, please let me know, and I'll be glad to address that. So that kind of takes us through what I wanted to kind of highlight for today's session in the setup menu. And now we're going to move to the main menu in Accounts Receivable. And we're going to talk about a couple of different things in under the main menu. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the Invoice History Inquiry. When we either make collection calls, when we maybe send out customer statements, and a customer calls in and says, I didn't receive a copy of invoice 123. Can you send me a copy of it? Obviously, you can access it through customer maintenance, but you can also go in through Invoice History Inquiry, and instead of pulling it up by the customer and then looking for the invoice, you could actually type in the invoice number, and I'm going to type a number in, and hopefully I can find one that's on file. Okay, let me just do a lookup here, and that's not what I wanted to do. I'm sorry. Let me just grab one of these real quick. So if a customer gives you the invoice number, you can type it in. It's going to pull up the invoice, and then you can go down and then just click the printer icon and either print a hard copy or you can print it to PDF and resend that to the customer if you need to. So it's just a way that might save you a couple of clicks if you're having to resend invoices to your customer base. So I wanted to show you that feature. And then the next thing that we're going to talk about is repetitive invoice entry. And I don't know if any of you utilize this feature, but it can come in very handy. And what this allows you to do is basically create a template for repetitive invoices to a customer. So maybe in your business you have a monthly service fee, so that you have a whole lump of customers that every month you're charging them a $250 service fee. Well, instead of having to go in each month and key 250 invoices, you can set up the repetitive invoice once and then create invoices based on that repetitive invoice. So, again, maybe monthly service fees. You might have, maybe you rent equipment, so you know what that monthly rental fee is, that you can create a repetitive invoice. If you lease property, office space, warehouses, again, equipment, anything like that that's repetitive, then this is something that may save you a lot of time. So What you do to set up the repetitive invoice in the beginning is, and let me find one that I set up earlier today. And this example is I set it up for rent. But basically, you're going to select the customer, and then you give it a reference. And the only kind of downfall to this is your reference can only be 4 characters. It can be alpha and or numeric. So I just used rent so that it was easy for me to find what that was for. If you have, let's say that you have a fleet of trucks, and your trucks have numbers of 101, 102, through 500. You could put the truck number as the reference if you wanted to. If your customer's given you a PO number, you can enter that here. Then the next area is to select a cycle, which means how often do you want to create an invoice from the repetitive master invoice. And if you'll notice, I don't have a little lookup here. So this is user defined, and it's very helpful to remember what cycles you have identified, and for everyone in your organization to use the same cycle codes. So I would say do something simple, like if you are billing people weekly, then maybe give it a cycle of W. I used M for monthly. If you bill things quarterly, you might use Q. You might use A or Y for something that's an annual fee, maybe membership fees or something of that nature. You could set that up. So whatever it is, just be consistent. So if I'm going to use M for monthly, then any repetitive invoice that I set up that I want to bill on a monthly basis, then I want to use that same cycle code. I can give it a start billing date and a stop billing date. So let's say that Shepherd Motorworks is renting something from us that starts this month, and they're renting, their agreement is for 12 months. So I could say that I want to stop billing that on May 1st of 2020. I'm going to say whether or not there's sales tax included. This is actually going to pull from the customer file, but you can override it at this point. It's also going to pull the terms code, the ship method, and the salesperson from the customer master file. So if it's different for this particular invoice, then you certainly can make that change. And again, make any changes that you need to on this first screen. The last build and the times build is you leave this blank, and then it's actually going to fill in this information and update it every time you generate a regular invoice against the repetitive invoice. So then you're going to go to your Lines tab, and this is where you're going to fill in, just like you would any invoice, what the items are and how much you're charging them. On your Totals tab, it's going to look basically like an invoice, a regular invoice. So I'm going to accept this. If I can have multiple repetitive invoices for a customer. I just can't use the same reference more than once for a particular customer. I could use the reference of rent for 50 different customers, but I couldn't use the reference of rent twice on Shepherd because it will think I'm pulling up the original one. I can have multiple cycles, so I could have that this particular rent is monthly, and then I may have a different type of repetitive invoice to Shepherd that's on a quarterly basis. So again, I can have multiple repetitive invoices per customer. And then each month when I decide that it's time for me to bill my customers, I go into repetitive invoice selection, give it a batch number if you're doing batch entry, and then it's going to say, okay, the invoice date is going to be today's date, or I could change that. If I want to pick everybody that's monthly in May, but I don't want to have I want the invoice date to be the 15th. Whoops, the 15th. I could change that. If I have clients that have issues or collection problems and I put them on hold, I can also have it go ahead and invoice as customers that may be on hold. I have a selection date, and then I have the next invoice number, which flows through the normal Sage process. So I could say that I want to do any reference that is equal to, and you'll notice again I don't have a lookup, so I'd have to type in rent, and I'm going to click proceed. And based on this, any customer that has a reference of rent that has not been billed in May is going to be selected. So I'm going to click proceed. And it did not make a selection. And how I can tell that, let me try this again. I think I put them on hold. There we go. How I could tell nothing happened is my clear button was still grayed out. I had forgotten that, as an example, I put that customer on hold a few minutes or before the presentation today. So basically, at this point, anything that met this criteria, what it has actually done is, if I go into invoice data entry and I pull up my batch, and I do a lookup, I can see where it has actually created that invoice for me. So there's time involved in setting it up initially, but if you have, it might even save you time if you just have 30 or 40 things that are repetitive a month. But we have some clients that have, 400 or 500 or even 1,000 invoices that are pretty much the same thing every month. This is going to save you a lot of time. So next month, when I'm ready to do my June invoices, I don't have to do anything in the repetitive invoice entry. I go directly to my selection, put in my criteria, make the selection, and then it will create that invoice for me. I would print it like normal. I would then, you have your sales journal to update as well as your daily transaction register, but it's a way to save yourself a lot of data entry if you run into that scenario. So if I go back and I want to take a look at this invoice, and I'm going to pull up the one for rent, you'll notice that nothing has happened here yet, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and preview those invoices very quickly that it created. And bear with the system for just a moment. We'll just do this batch because I've got just a bunch of test batches out there. And again, my system is a little slow. And I'm just going to preview. And you can actually then, this is the invoice. You can see the 2 lines on there. I'll go ahead and just exit out of here. And again, just very quickly, and I have no idea why that keeps popping up. I'm having to give it a future date because my demo date is in future. here, and no, and yes. And we'll just say no to that. Now when I go back in and look at my repetitive entry, I can see the last time it was billed and how many times I've billed that customer. And what that does, the reason it builds this in once you have created that invoice and updated it, is that you cannot accidentally go in and rebill this client in May. It knows that you billed it in May and that you don't want to bill it again. And if I tried to do a selection now that said, start billing anything that has these dates, it would not select this one to create an invoice. So, does anyone have any questions about repetitive invoices? Now, again, this in accounts receivable, this would be related to things that are not inventory related. If you use inventory management and sales order, I believe we're talking about sales order next month, you have the ability to do master and repeating orders within the sales order module as well, and those would tie in and integrate with your inventory. So, does anyone have any questions about this at this time? If you do, go ahead and type it in, and I will be glad to take a look at that. Okay. I'm going to talk about the customer memos for a few minutes, and I'm going to go back into customer maintenance. And that PowerPoint just wants to keep popping up. So in customer maintenance, you'll notice on each of your customers that you have an icon at the top. And it is, if you hover it over, it shows you that it's the memo. If you see this, you'll see that this one is yellow. I'm going to click through just to a couple of other customers. Notice how this one is just very plain. That's an indication when I immediately look that there is not a memo at all on that particular customer. So I wanted to go back and give you a couple of examples of these memos and why you might use them. So for this company, we actually have a couple of different memo codes set up in here. And a great thing that you can do with this is manage your collections. So you can keep track of all of your collection calls. You can set up reminders, and you can actually run reports based on these memos. So this has an example of 2018 collection calls, and then it has kind of another bad example that just says collect for collection calls. You can choose to name it whatever you want, but I'll give you an example of how we manage it here at Oasis. We have a separate memo for collections based on the year. So if I go in and take a look at a customer and I see that there's a memo on this customer called 2018, I know that we had some type of collection activity with them in the year 2018. And it would list any of the calls that we have made and the history of those collections. If I have not yet made any calls in 2019, but I do need to make a call to them today, then actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new customer memo. I'm going to call it 2019 and call it 2019 collection calls. And then I can go in and free-form type in this space. So what we typically do is that if I make a call today, I'm going to put in a date. and just put in whatever you want. Again, it's free form text. And if I've talked to someone, I've sent them another copy of the invoice, and they tell me that they're going to make the payment on the 20th, then I'm going to think, okay, well, it should definitely be here by the 25th. And I'll just put that date in. Put in a reminder date. And then I can just click accept. And then what I can do, it doesn't do anything other than it just creates this memo on this customer. It does not generically create a 2019 memo code on any other customer. It's only on this particular customer. So I put my notes in, and let's say that I move to my next customer that I need to make a collection call to. I would do the same thing. I would call it 2019. And I would put in my date. And I could, again, set up a reminder date of the 20th or whatever date I need to. And then save this information as well. And then what I can do is that next week or 2 weeks from now, when I want to see who has promised me payments, I can go into the reports. I can go to, so in accounts receivable reports, customer memo printing. I can say that I want to print this report if the memo code is equal to, and if I do a lookup, you're going to see the various memo codes, 2019. And if it has a reminder date of, we'll say, the 15th through the 30th, if I just want to grab more information, and then preview this, and anything that falls within that date is actually going to show up on a report for me. So this is helpful. A lot of people will run an aging report, and then they make notes on the aging report after they call people. Then 2 or 3 weeks later, they run the aging report again. Whoever's still on that report, then they recopy their notes, and that can take a lot of time. So this can save you a lot of time in keeping track of that information. So let's say that the client does not pay when they say they're going to. So what I would do, you also can have that memo pop up anytime anybody goes into that customer, which is what that other memo is doing. So let's say that they don't make a payment and I have to call them again. What I do, I like to keep the most current notes at the top. So I might say, payment not received. If I could type, and then continue that information. Maybe they promised that it's going to go out now on June 1st. They had a problem. Then I would change these reminder dates so that I could run a report, again, based on these new promise dates. I understand that. And it makes you do the end date first. I don't think it did that in the other versions, but in this particular version, it does. I had that problem earlier, so now I can change this to 060119. Well, 1, 2. Okay. So then I can save this again and run a report. If they pay, then I don't need to worry about anything, and then I may not have to call them again until October. I'll still use the 2019 memo code, and then I would record my collection call from October as well. The great thing about this, too, is that you do have a history of what you've done, and that way, if you have to escalate it, you can say, on these dates I spoke to this person, and this is what was promised. But it keeps track of all of that. The other thing that you can do in here, and I'm not sure if you would need to do it for collections, but maybe you're sending a collection letter, or maybe you've turned them over to collections, and the collection agency that you use sends you a copy of the letter that they've sent to the client. You have the ability where you can attach a document to this customer memo as well. So just wanted to go through that and show you the memo feature is throughout Sage 100 and can be used a lot of different ways. If you have a customer that is a prepay status, or the client has always told you that you have to obtain a purchase order number from them in order to be able to bill them. In here we've got an invoicing policy. You could have it say that that this client is always required to give you a purchase order number before you can process an order. And this auto display, that's where you can have it pop up at the reminder date, or always means anytime you're really doing anything for that customer, and it'll even flow through to sales order if you're doing a sales order quote or a sales order itself, a sales order invoice, that you can have that pop up and provide that information to whoever is doing the data entry. So I just wanted to make you aware of that as well. So I will ask if anyone has any questions at this point. If you do, please raise your hand and type the question in, and I'll be glad to answer that. Okay, the next thing that we are going to talk about today is one thing I don't know that we've covered before, and that is how to write off a bad debt. So let's say that, I've made my collection efforts. Maybe the company has gone out of business. Maybe you just know that they're not going to pay, and you don't want to keep that receivable on your books, and you want to write off that bad debt. What some people choose to do is they do a credit memo and just apply it against that original invoice. That is not what I would consider the preferred way, because then with that credit memo, you really don't have an audit trail or any way to go back and take a look and see what was, maybe the credit memo was issued because you billed the wrong customer, they returned the merchandise and you needed to send them a credit, versus what actually was written off and is truly a bad debt. So to write off a bad debt, the first thing that you need is you need to know what GL account you're going to use for your bad debts, and have a GL account number set up. And then what you're going to do is go into accounts receivable in main, and we're actually going to do a cash receipt entry. So I'm going to go into customer maintenance, and I'm going to show you. We're going to pick an invoice here. And we're going to pick this invoice number, let's see, let's do 203. We'll say that this invoice is a bad debt, and we're going to write this invoice off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my cash receipts entry. And if I'm doing batch entry, I'm just going to give it a batch number, which is fine. I give it a deposit number like you normally would, but my deposit amount is going to be 0. And I could even give it a description of bad debt write-offs if I had several that I was going to process at one time. I'm going to click accept. And then at this point, when my next screen pops up, I will select my customer, And where it says check number, I like to use something that's consistent that I always use, and either use something like bad debt or maybe write-off, whatever you want to use so that you know why this transaction was made. The amount received is going to be 0. I'm going to go to my Lines tab, and I'm going to select the invoice that I'm going to write off. So we was going to write off number 203. And because I told it my deposit is 0, the amount posted here is showing 0. So I want to type in my the amount posted. Then my next line item, instead of saying the line type is an invoice, I'm going to change it to GL account. It's going to open up my GL account field, and then I'm going to type in my bad debt account number, and then there's the offset. Okay? And I'm going to click accept. And then when I update this cash receipt, and I'm going to check my question real quick. It says, are these various functions such as billing and write-offs able to be limited to certain individuals? The answer to that is yes. But if an individual has the ability to do cash receipt entry, then they would be able to do normal cash receipts, or they would be able to do write-offs. So if you have access to cash receipt entry, then you would have the ability to do either one. If you needed the ability to where only certain people could do, let's say, 0 cash receipts, which is also what you do when you're applying a debit to a credit on a customer, is you do a 0 cash receipt to offset those. I don't think that through regular Sage that can be limited to certain users. There is probably something that could be done custom scripting wise in order to do that. So if that is a huge concern, then let us know, and that's something that I could check with William and see if that's something that could be done with custom scripting, and how involved it would be to do a script such as that. So hopefully that answered your question. If not, you can feel free to send a follow-up question. So once I've entered my write-off, my bad debt, again, if I had, maybe at the end of the year I sit down with a list and I have 50 invoices that I'm writing off for various customers, you could do them all within one 0 deposit. So then my next step is to print my cash receipts journal. And it's showing the information. It's showing that it is crediting my accounts receivable and it's debiting my bad debt account. And I'm going to say update, yes. And for time purposes today, I'm going to just bypass the daily transaction register, though that is not something that you should normally do. You want to make sure that you're updating both of those, because the daily transaction register is what updates the general ledger. The cash receipts journal is updating my AR module, but the daily transaction register is what is updating the general ledger. So if I go back in and I look at this customer, and I look at invoices, if I look at this invoice right on this screen, I'm going to actually see that it has a 0 balance. But if I drill down and take a look, because I'm using the check number bad debt or using something consistent, I can easily take a look and see that I did write something off and it is not just a regular paid invoice. The other thing that I probably would do in this situation is I would probably add, they probably would already had collection notes in here, but I would add to my collection note that on this day I wrote off invoice 203 in the amount of the $10,474.73, just to make a note of that, so that, you know, should they come back and want to do business with you, then you can, talk with them and negotiate what you've had to write off in the past. So again, you can, and you could also create some reports through Crystals where you could take a look without having to actually drill down on each invoice. If I look at the transactions, which shows all the transactions for an invoice, you can see here as well that you have bad debt. And I can sort by this field, so I could actually sort by customer and see any of them that had a check number of bad debt to give me an idea of how many things I've written off for that particular customer. So any questions about that? I know we get that question a lot on how to write those off. Again, the reason for being able to really track that is I want to make sure that I know who has a history and where we've had to write things off. So maybe, you have a change in controllers, you get a new CFO, it's going to be very easy for them to determine what type of history that client has had by doing it this way. If I just did a credit memo and adjusted it off, then it's not going to track that bad debt account. It's going to take it out of my sales, and you're really not going to have any history of why that credit memo was issued. Obviously, you could put notes on the credit memo, but then you'd have to drill down into it to see that detail. And I like to be able to see as much as I can at a glance without having to keep drilling down into various areas. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand on that. And we're just about out of time, and I had one more thing that I was going to briefly talk about, so I think that will take us to the end of the session today, is that we get questions a lot, especially at year end, and when people are going through an audit, that the aged invoice report and the trial balance report don't match. And actually, let me step back a second. The auditors usually want you to run an aged invoice report, and that invoice report needs to match to the general ledger. And a lot of times that report does not match, and clients are calling to find out why does that not match. So the aged invoice report is based upon the invoice date. The trial balance is based on the posting date, and that posting date ties directly to your general ledger. So your accounts receivable trial balance report, if you're running it as of a certain date for open invoices, should always match your general ledger AR account. And if they don't, and you're running it for the exact same dates, then you do have an issue somewhere. And it could be where somebody, instead of writing off an invoice properly, like we just did, maybe they went in and just made a journal entry. And so that transaction was not generated through AR, but it was done as a general journal entry. So those two aren't going to match. So the aging report and the trial balance may never match, unless you're kind of running them out through the end of time, and then they should total. But the aged invoice report is based upon the invoice date. The trial balance is based upon the posting date. So you could literally have a difference if your invoice is dated May the 30th, but you did not post that until June the 1st. So it's going to show up on those reports basically in two different months because of the date discrepancy. So if anybody has any questions about that, please let me know. And that pretty much concludes our presentation for today. Again, if you have any questions that you can think of after the fact, please feel free to email me at pam@oasisky.com. If you did not receive an invitation to our Sage 100 user group meeting, which is going to be held on June the 27th, send me an email and we will make sure that you get an invitation. It is free to any Sage 100 end user. So feel free to do that as well. And next month's webinar should be on sales order. So it will tie it back to accounts receivable, but it is on sales orders, tips and tricks, and you will be getting invitations to that webinar as well. So I want to thank everyone for their time today. I appreciate it, and just let us know how we can help you. Thank you. Bye-bye.